I'm VJ Hamilton and welcome to the Autoimmune Reset, the place for you to learn how to thrive with autoimmune disease and feel empowered to take steps to transform your health to feel better than ever. You can start making changes today to improve your health. So with every episode, my mission is to share with you simple ways to up-level your diet and lifestyle with key learnings from my own journey reversing autoimmune disease and inspirational stories from those who have reset their autoimmune symptoms and are now thriving in life. I suffered from autoimmune disease for over 25 years and now I live symptom-free, and I wish the same for you as well. So thank you for being here and sharing this time with me. Now let's get started. Hello and welcome back to the Autoimmune Reset podcast. I'm your host, VJ Hamilton. I'm a nutritionist, scientist, and expert in autoimmune disease. And I'm glad you're here today because today we are going to be talking about a condition that affects millions of people, and that is inflammatory bowel disease, or what is often referred to as IBD. And in my clinic, I work with many clients who have ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. And I want to talk to you today about the approach that I take when I'm working with clients, but also run through some of the underlying root causes of IBD and how it differentiates to some other conditions like irritable bowel syndrome, which can sometimes be mixed up with IBD, but there is testing that can help to confirm that. We'll also be exploring some of the environmental factors that increase IBD risk and then dive into some of the natural approaches that, as I said, I use with my clients. So let's first talk about how IBD differs from IBS, because this is really important to understand. And if you are having gut issues, and especially if you're having some more worrying or concerning symptoms of these types of gut issues, then one of the first things that your doctor will want to do is to understand whether this is IBS or IBD or something else. And while both of these conditions do affect the digestive system, they are quite different. So we have IBD, which, as I said, is inflammatory bowel disease. That is a chronic condition which includes both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, and it is an autoimmune disease, which is why I work a lot with it in clinic. I work a lot with gut health for various different autoimmune conditions, but I also work with autoimmune conditions that specifically affect the gut, and that is the case for ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. And in these conditions, the immune system is mistakenly attacking the gut lining, which leads to ulcers, bleeding, and even scarring. But when it comes to IBS, which is irritable bowel syndrome, this is a functional disorder, but it doesn't have the visible inflammation that you get with ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. It often involves symptoms like abdominal pain, bloating, and altered bowel habits. What I normally find is that when clients develop different types of autoimmune conditions such as psoriasis or rheumatoid arthritis or some other inflammatory conditions like fibromyalgia, they may have been diagnosed with IBS previously, and then due to several other factors, this can then go on to develop into an autoimmune condition. But it is quite different to inflammatory bowel disease. And as I said, one of the first things to confirm with your doctor is to determine which one of these conditions you are suffering with. And there is a lot of testing that can be done, and the doctors may test for something called calprotectin. That is also tested on the stool test that I run in my clinic, and that can give you a good indication of whether it is inflammatory bowel disease or irritable bowel syndrome. And also your doctor will review your symptoms as well to get to that diagnosis. But then we have two different types of inflammatory bowel disease. And when I'm working with clients, it's important for me to know which one my client is suffering with, because there is going to be a different approach that I will take therapeutically dependent on whether it is Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. Because as I said, inflammatory bowel disease is this umbrella term that is covering these two types of autoimmune gut issues. Because when it comes to Crohn's disease, that's going to affect a different part of the digestive tract. And Crohn's disease commonly affects the small intestine and the beginning of the colon. But when it comes to ulcerative colitis, it's more likely to affect the colon and the rectum. So I've worked with clients who have experienced Crohn's symptoms in various areas of the GI tract, whereas with ulcerative colitis, it's normally more localized and, as I said, that lower end of the digestive tract. Inflammatory bowel disease is a multifaceted condition, and it's influenced, as with many autoimmune conditions, by genetic and environmental factors. And while we can't change our genetics, understanding these environmental risk factors really helps to empower us to manage our symptoms, and that goes for other autoimmune conditions as well. And it's just worth saying that you do have more of a risk if you have parents who have inflammatory bowel disease, and there is an 8% risk of developing inflammatory bowel disease if one of your parents has IBD, and you have a 30% risk if both your parents have IBD. So you just need to weigh out the risk factor when it comes to genetics, but environment is one of the most powerful ways to manage your symptoms and your health regardless of your genetics. But understanding your genetics is helpful, and I have said before on this podcast that I did my own genetic variation testing, which is called single nucleotide polymorphisms, often referred to as SNPs. And by understanding where you have certain genetic variations, it can be extremely helpful in understanding which areas or which systems, should I say, in your body you should focus on when it comes to diet and lifestyle interventions. But let's look at some of the root causes that can lead to inflammatory bowel disease based on the most up-to-date research. And one of them, and this again goes for many of the autoimmune conditions, is this hygiene hypothesis. And the hygiene hypothesis is a really fascinating idea to explain why IBD in particular is more common in developed countries, because the concept is around the fact that when we are children, we're not as exposed to as many germs as we should be as human beings. And that's because we grow up in these very clean environments. We're more worried about infections. That can have a knock-on impact to our immune system and our gut health as well. This lack of exposure to germs means that your gut microbiome might not be as diverse, and we know it's variety and diversity which is the most important factor when it comes to our gut microbiome, as long as it's the beneficial bacteria that we want to be included in the gut. And if we don't get that exposure early on in life, then that can cause imbalance, which may lead to dysbiosis. And dysbiosis is where you have an imbalance of different gut bacteria in your gut, and that can lead to these types of conditions like inflammatory bowel disease and other autoimmune conditions as well, because we know 70% of the immune system is in the gut. So if things aren't balanced in your gut, then they're far less likely to be balanced in your immune system as well. Another risk factor for inflammatory bowel disease, particularly Crohn's disease, is smoking. And smoking is associated with a higher risk of Crohn's disease, and it increases flare-ups and symptom severity. However, it doesn't seem to have the same effect with ulcerative colitis. And the mechanism behind this might be that smoking disrupts the gut microbiome, it increases inflammation and reduces blood flow to the intestines, and that can significantly worsen symptoms of Crohn's. And I know we often think about smoking affecting our lungs and affecting our liver and our bladder, but it can have this knock-on effect to so many different areas. And I expect if you're listening to this podcast, you're already taking steps to improve your health. If you are a smoker, that is going to make a huge difference in your health if you quit smoking, and you're going to reap the benefits of everything else you're doing. So that's just one to bear in mind if that is a factor for you, because sometimes we just think about it in isolation. We think about it for our lung health and our respiratory health, but it can have an effect on different organs and systems in the body too. The next risk factor is urban living, and studies have shown that urban living is linked to a higher risk of inflammatory bowel disease, which is likely due to the increased pollution that is in the air in more of a city environment. It could also be to do with changes in diet and reduced exposure to natural microbes, which again goes back to that hygiene hypothesis. But also the research has found that urban living meant that people were eating more ultra-processed foods, and these ultra-processed foods are a significant risk factor for Crohn's as well, and it can actually double the risk of Crohn's. So if you are eating an ultra-processed foods diet, that can double the risk of Crohn's, which is, just showing how much the food that we eat can affect us. Because I know I've worked with clients who have had Crohn's disease and they have just thought it was part of who they were. It was part of their genetics. But the truth is, eating an ultra-processed food diet doubles the risk of Crohn's, whereas your genetics is a much smaller percentage when it comes to risk factors, and that's always worth bearing in mind. Another risk factor is having a tonsillectomy, and I have seen many clients in my clinic who have had tonsillectomies. I always find it fascinating when I see patterns in my client's history, understanding what might have contributed to the development of their conditions, and tonsillectomy comes up time and time again. And research does suggest that the removal of your tonsils may increase the risk of developing Crohn's disease, and that's potentially due to the immune and microbiome shifts that can happen because the tonsils are part of your body's lymphatic system. They play a key role in training your immune system by exposing your immune system to pathogens early in life, and when the tonsils are removed, the immune system may lose some regulation, and that can possibly lead to the immune dysregulation and increased inflammation that we see in autoimmune conditions, and those are linked to Crohn's. Additionally, a tonsillectomy can disrupt the balance of bacteria in the gut microbiome, and that can increase the presence of inflammatory bacteria. And one of the bacteria that I see commonly in people that have had a tonsillectomy is that they have streptococcus in their gut, and that would ordinarily reside in the back of the throat. But that disruption can heighten the risk of gut inflammation, and that may explain why a tonsillectomy is strongly associated with Crohn's rather than ulcerative colitis. The next is antibiotic use, which I'm sure you're not surprised by, but this is particularly in childhood. And part of my own, what I call my story, is that when I was very young, they thought I had a gut infection, and it was actually a dairy allergy, or it was a dairy sensitivity. And I was pumped full of antibiotics at I believe my mum said I was 6 weeks old. And that can have just such a knock-on effect to your immunity, especially as a child, but as you grow up. And my health history is probably a great way to illustrate that, in the fact that I, as a child developed an autoimmune condition, in my teenage years developed a second autoimmune condition, and then ended up with chronic fatigue syndrome. And it's not to say that that has to be the case if you have had antibiotics as a child, because there is lots that you can do to help to support your gut microbiome, but it has been shown to be a risk factor in inflammatory bowel disease. And of course, that's to do with the fact that antibiotics disrupt the gut microbiome. They often kill off the beneficial bacteria, which can lead to this overgrowth of inflammatory and pathogenic bacteria. And that's often what I'm looking for when I run a stool test for my clients, I'm looking for these pathogenic bacteria that may be contributing to their symptoms. But studies show that children who take multiple rounds of antibiotics, similar to what I do, have a significantly higher risk of developing IBD later in life. And lastly, we have vitamin D deficiency, which is a common theme when it comes to an autoimmune condition, because vitamin D is essential for immune function, and low levels have been shown to be associated with IBD. So adequate vitamin D can help to regulate that immune response and support the gut barrier function. And it's always worth testing your vitamin D levels if you haven't tested them for a while, if you haven't had a lot of sun exposure recently, just to check that your levels are optimal, because if you have any risk of developing an autoimmune condition, or if you have a diagnosed autoimmune condition, then you need to make sure that your vitamin D levels are staying at that optimal level to keep your immune system in check. Now, as I said, I am going to talk to you about how I approach this when I'm working with my clients who have inflammatory bowel disease. And I will use the 5R framework, which again, I've spoken about on the podcast before. So feel free to go back to that episode if you'd like to listen to what the 5R protocol is, but I'm going to be going through it now as well. The 5R approach stands for remove, replace, reinoculate, repair, and rebalance. And you would ordinarily take it in that order, but sometimes if I feel like my client really needs support in one of those particular areas, I might support that area first. It really just depends. But when it comes to the first step, remove, what we're really looking for there is to remove any harm that is affecting the gut, such as inflammatory foods or specific mediators or potentially dietary triggers. And in Crohn's disease, as I said, ultra-processed foods is a significant risk factor. So there are certain diets like the Crohn's disease exclusion diet, and that's a structured plan that limits trigger foods and focuses on whole food, nutrient-dense options. And there are even diets like the liquid nutritional formula, which is a liquid diet which can help manage flare-ups and can give the gut a rest, but at the same time make sure that you have those nutrients which are much more easily absorbed, because it often isn't as easy to know what to eat when you have inflammatory bowel disease. And again, that's something that my clients will come to me about because they just feel like they can't eat anything anymore, and they will go and read about the beneficial foods for gut health, and it really just doesn't apply to them, because when it comes to ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, when you are in an active flare, actually eating those high fiber foods can do more harm than good. And that's why you need to be really careful. But at the same time, you don't want to make yourself nutrient deficient by not eating anything at all. And that's where this Crohn's disease exclusion diet or the liquid nutritional formula diet can be helpful, especially in those active flares, because we want to make sure as much as possible that we're not creating any more damage in the digestive tract that could potentially become irreversible. We want to make sure that we're bringing down inflammation as quickly as possible. Now, I wanted to touch on one particular group of foods, if you want to call it, but additives called emulsifiers, which are found in many processed foods, and they help to improve the shelf life and texture. That's why they're added to foods. But what they found with IBD is that these emulsifiers can disrupt the gut barrier and negatively impact the microbiome. And common emulsifiers include ingredients like polysorbate 80 and carboxymethyl cellulose. So certainly be looking on the back of any of the processed foods that you're eating to look out for this. Because if you have IBD and you are already inflamed and your gut lining is already sensitive, then emulsifiers can exacerbate symptoms by promoting leaky gut. So essentially, they increase gut permeability and they allow harmful bacteria and toxins to enter the bloodstream, which then can fire up an immune response and worsen inflammation. Now, a lot of the studies have been done on animals, but they have shown that emulsifiers can induce gut inflammation, and similar effects have been observed in some human studies as well. but they seem to promote the growth of these harmful bacteria. As I mentioned, they're the bacteria that I'm looking for when I'm running a stool test for my clients. And when there is the growth of these harmful bacteria, that can lead to these imbalances and further irritation of the intestinal lining, and that can lead to Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. If you have an inflammatory bowel disease or you have any gut symptoms at the moment, I really recommend reading all your labels carefully and minimizing processed foods that contain emulsifiers. Instead, you should focus on eating a whole food diet as much as you possibly can with minimal processed foods, because then you know what is in the food that you're eating and you know there aren't those added ingredients that could potentially be contributing to you having a flare-up. And you can just think about easy swaps when it comes to foods. And you find a lot of these emulsifiers in salad dressings, which you can't really believe, because you think a salad dressing would be pretty natural, but the truth is they are added to a lot of these products, as I said, because they improve the shelf life as well. But with a dressing, you can just make something as simple as extra virgin olive oil and balsamic vinegar and mix those together, and that's just a delicious salad dressing. Or extra virgin olive oil and some lemon and garlic. So there are lots of ways that you can make your food still taste delicious, but without the emulsifiers and the additives that could potentially cause a flare-up for you. Next is replace, and this is where we're looking at replacing any missing gastric juices like digestive enzymes, bile salts or stomach acid. And for the most part, I'm really looking for symptoms that might relate to issues with the digestive function. Again, it is tested in a stool test, but there are lots of ways that I can assess that by looking at my client's symptoms, and that will give me a really good idea of what might be going on in the gut and understanding what their bowel habits are like, and using the Bristol stool chart to understand whether they have any fat in their stool or if there's any issues with that whole process. As I said, testing can be extremely helpful for that too. I may ask my clients to do the bicarbonate of soda test when it comes to checking for stomach acid. It's certainly not a diagnostic test, but you can just put a teaspoonful of baking soda into some water, drink it, and then wait to see how long it takes you to burp. And if it does take any longer than 3 minutes, then it may indicate that your stomach acid is lower than optimal. So that can be part of the picture. And obviously, if you have low stomach acid and you're not breaking down proteins properly, or you are not cleaning the food as well as, cleaning off the bacteria that should be kind of killed off at that stage in the process, then those bacteria can get into the small intestine. That's where it can cause this overgrowth effect, or the proteins that haven't been properly digested can then become antigenic, and they can start promoting an immune response, because that's the thing with your immune response, it's reacting to proteins. So that's why if you don't break down proteins, it can cause a significant issue when it comes to your gut and immune health. Next is looking at reinoculation, and this involves restoring the beneficial bacteria in the gut. So you've taken out anything that might be triggering inflammation, you've replaced any nutrients that you need to help with the digestive function, and then you're looking at reinoculation. And that's when you might be thinking about prebiotics, probiotics, and bringing prebiotic food into the diet if my client is ready for that at that stage. And to be honest, sometimes they're not, and they're not able to digest those foods optimally. But sometimes adding in a probiotic, especially if we found that they're low in certain beneficial bacteria, that can be helpful. And just making sure that there are foods included in the diet with lots of variety that are going to help to feed those beneficial gut bacteria to help them thrive. But the truth is, just bringing in a variety of foods that are going to help everything be in balance in the gut is kind of my main focus. And I take a very steady approach when it comes to things like probiotics and prebiotics, especially in inflammatory bowel disease, because what you don't want to do is to take anything that's too disruptive, and then that can lead to a flare. And then we look at repair, and the fourth step in this 5-hour protocol is to focus on healing the gut lining and reducing inflammation. And as I said, sometimes this might be the area that I look at first, because that can just help somebody when they're in an active flare. And some of the key nutrients that I use to help with the gut lining are omega-3 fatty acids, which have potent anti-inflammatory properties. This includes EPA and DHA, which are in fish oil and oily fish. And they really help to reduce inflammation at the cellular level, so at that gut lining cellular level, and that helps to reduce the frequency and severity of IBD flare-ups, and there is research to support that. There's also vitamin D. I mentioned earlier that was a risk factor, but vitamin D is essential for this immune modulation, which is a key piece of the immune system, especially for an autoimmune disease. So the best thing to do is to check your vitamin D levels, and then you can decide whether supplementing is the right option for you. But also, if you are thinking about any type of supplementation, you are best to work with your health care provider or a nutritionist just to make sure that it's right for you, because it's not going to be right for everybody. And then there is boswellia or frankincense. And this helps to target specific inflammatory pathways and is often well tolerated by IBD patients. So I really like bringing in these types of nutrients, because when there is this inflammatory cascade, they can inhibit certain processes in the body and help to bring down inflammation. And you can actually target different pathways of the inflammatory response with different nutrients. But boswellia and frankincense have been shown to be particularly helpful when it comes to inflammatory bowel disease, with both ulcerative colitis and Crohn's. And then I might think about supplementing immunoglobulins, which are derived from colostrum, and these can act as a buffer in the gut. They can protect the lining and they can reduce immune activation. They also help to bind to toxins and pathogens. So they help to keep the gut barrier in check, and they help to keep out any of those unhelpful bacteria that could build up in the gut, and also the toxins that can create an inflammatory response. Another anti-inflammatory nutrient which I have been using with my clients who have inflammatory bowel disease, and they have been able to see relief from their symptoms quite quickly after using this, is curcumin. And again, curcumin is a really powerful anti-inflammatory, and it helps to reduce any chronic inflammation that is obviously central to these types of conditions. And curcumin again works by inhibiting inflammatory molecules, and one in particular called NF-kappa B, which is responsible for many different inflammatory responses in the body. And curcumin can help with this, and it helps by blocking that inflammatory process. And studies have shown that curcumin can help to reduce inflammatory markers in both Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, and can really help to alleviate symptoms. And as I said, I've used it in my clinic many times, and I've seen my clients find effective relief from managing their symptoms through using curcumin. Many have reported that they just felt like their inflammation had come down, that they were having fewer flare-ups, and they just felt like their overall quality of life had improved as well. For example, I have quite a few clients who have severe foot pain when they come to see me. And by taking this approach, by using these nutrients to help bring down their inflammatory cascade that is happening in their body and causing these inflammatory symptoms, they find relief by using these anti-inflammatory nutrients. And they will often tell me, even at the second appointment, that they have noticed that the pain in their feet has got substantially better. And that's great, because just that symptom alone can have such an impact on your quality of life. So it's definitely, something to look into. But as I said, it's always best working with a practitioner when you're thinking about using anything like curcumin or vitamin D, because they can be contraindicated with medications and other conditions. But there is a very interesting body of research around this. There's also research looking at curcumin and its effect on the gut microbiome, and we know that a healthy, balanced microbiome is essential in managing IBD. Curcumin seems to help the growth of these beneficial bacteria in the gut, and also it helps to inhibit pathogenic bacteria. So it not only has this anti-inflammatory property to it, but it can also help to modulate parts of the gut microbiome, which then leads to these long-lasting changes in our bodies, which helps us to manage our symptoms for the long term. Now, if you're considering adding curcumin for your IBD management, then it is, just worth bearing in mind that it does have quite a low bioavailability, and that's why many of the supplements now include things like black pepper extract or piperine, and that can help to enhance the absorption. So you want to be looking for that if you are looking at supplementing, just to make sure that you get the most value from the supplement that you are taking. But in terms of dosage, when I've been working with clients, I normally use a range of say 500 milligrams to actually 3 grams. But that is working with me in a supportive environment where I'm monitoring how they're getting on, but it is generally safe as long as you keep to the right dosage. So to sum up, curcumin is a really fantastic option for those with inflammatory bowel disease. It has these anti-inflammatory, antioxidant and immune modulating effects, which can be extremely helpful with inflammatory bowel disease. And it's certainly one of my favorite anti-inflammatory nutrients to add when I'm working with clients with inflammatory bowel disease. And then lastly, we have Rebalance. And this is the 5th step in the 5-hour protocol. And it really involves managing lifestyle factors to support your gut-brain health, because we know there is this bidirectional communication between the gut and the brain. And if you're chronically stressed, then it's going to be harder to recover from conditions like inflammatory bowel disease. So incorporating practices that are going to help to calm down your stress response is going to be helpful. It will mean that you are going to find that with all the other lifestyle and dietary changes that you're making are going to be more impactful and more meaningful, because when you are in a calm state, you are more likely to be able to restore your immune function. You're giving your body the best chance to recover. And that's why this is such an important piece in any protocol, to be honest, not just the 5-hour protocol, that we are focusing on ways to feel calmer in life. And I'll be honest, even with the life changes that I've had from being an accountant to now working as a nutritionist, but not only do I work as a nutritionist, I also run my own business. It's just that there is always going to be a stress in life, and it's unavoidable, really. And that's just the truth of it. And stress is very natural. It's, we've got these systems in the body to help us manage stress. Because as human beings and as animals, we all come across stresses in our lives, but it's how we manage that stress, how we process that stress, and how we deal with that stress that makes the most difference. So you need to find something that works for you. And it's taken me a long time to develop different activities and different practices that I do that help me. And I really find journaling is one of the ways that helps me to calm down my nervous system. I found Pilates. I find meditation soothing. I find walking out in nature. But you need to find what helps you and what makes you feel calm. And then recently I'm using my NeuroSim, which I absolutely love. And I've had clients who have used it as well. And some clients have been seeing some amazing benefits from it and some haven't. So it just shows that even when it comes to a device that has been designed to help calm down your stress response, it works for some people and not for others. And it's been hugely beneficial for me. And it just gives me that hour of a day where I know that I can bring down my stress response. And that's an hour in my day where I am in that therapeutic state of healing, which we all need to be on in a daily basis. So if you find it difficult doing it through certain practices, then maybe it's worth looking into the NeuroSim. And I will put the link in the show notes if you want to find out more about the NeuroSim and see how it could be beneficial for you. That's my typical approach when I am working with clients with inflammatory bowel disease. But as with any condition where I'm working with a client in a clinic, I am working with them as an individual rather than their diagnosis, as much as I take this all on board, because I do think it is important to look at the research, to understand how it's been effective, to understand the mechanisms, but also I work with the person and I work with their underlying imbalances and their history and their health. But these factors are important, and I do think that when you go through a structured protocol like the 5R protocol, which can take at a minimum 3 months, that's when I'm seeing my clients see these transformational changes in their health, because they have followed that protocol and they've gone through the steps to get their gut in a much better position so that they can manage their symptoms for the long term. But if you have any questions about this, feel free to pop over to my Instagram account, which is at the Autoimmunity Nutritionist. If you're looking at ways to lower inflammation, then I have my group program, the Inflammation Reset, which is a 10-step program. It's run over 10 weeks and you get live coaching as part of the program, but it really goes through the key areas in your life and in your health to help to lower down inflammation. There's personalization to it, so there is different diet protocols dependent on the areas that are going to be more meaningful to you. And we work on lots of different factors, including your diet, including your stress levels, including your sleep. And I just make sure that everybody that goes through that program comes out of it feeling empowered to make those healthy choices for themselves and for their lives. So if you'd like to find out more about that, you can just click the link in the show notes, and that will take you to the page, which is going to tell you a lot more about what is included in the Inflammation Reset. If not, have a fantastic rest of your week, and I'll be in touch soon. Take care. Thank you very much for joining me today on the Autoimmune Reset. I really hope you enjoyed the discussion, and be sure to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. And if you liked it, I would hugely appreciate a review on iTunes, as it helps me understand what you like about the podcast and to help share the information with more people. I'm excited to speak to you next time, and remember, you have the power to take the reins on your health. So keep the faith and celebrate the small wins. Until next time.